You are listening to Last Signal Radio. I am James Carter. If you can hear this broadcast, you are receiving one of the last stable radio transmissions on this frequency. Shortwave is holding. Most everything else is not. What is happening to the Earth right now is not a weather event, not a geopolitical crisis, not a technological failure. It is a planetary event. A geophysical event of a scale that has not occurred in approximately 780,000 years. The European Space Agency's Swarm satellite constellation, before it was lost, confirmed what geophysicists have been warning about for 2 decades. Earth's magnetic field is not merely weakening in isolated patches. It is inverting. The magnetic North Pole, which has been drifting toward Siberia at an accelerating rate for over a century, has now moved beyond any boundary that conventional compass navigation can account for. More critically, the field strength across the entire planet has dropped to approximately 8% of its baseline value in the past 72 hours. That number is not a typo. 8%. The shield that protects every living thing on this planet from the full radiation output of the sun is, for all practical purposes, gone.
I want to tell you what it looked like from the ground before we get into the science and the numbers, because I think the numbers will mean more if you understand what people actually saw first. In Sao Paulo, Brazil, a city that has never in recorded human history seen an aurora, the sky turned green and violet at dusk 2 nights ago. People stopped their cars on the marginal Pinheiros highway. They got out. They stood on the road and looked up. A teacher named Lucia, who was on her way home from an evening class, filmed it on her phone, and the video was shared 17 million times before the internet infrastructure in the region began to fail. She said in the video, quietly, almost to herself, that it looked like the sky was breathing. In Melbourne, Australia, the aurora was so bright that it was visible at noon, competing with sunlight, which is something no living human being had ever witnessed. In Delhi, in Lagos, in Houston, in Moscow, the sky became something none of us had a word for. Beautiful and wrong at the same time. Beautiful and terrifying. Like being shown something you were never supposed to see.
The scientific framework first, because it is essential to understanding the timeline and the threat. Earth's magnetic field is generated by the movement of molten iron in the outer core, approximately 2,900 kilometers beneath the surface. This geodynamo creates a magnetosphere that extends tens of thousands of kilometers into space and deflects the solar wind, the continuous stream of charged particles ejected by the sun. During a pole reversal, the field does not simply flip instantaneously. It weakens over a period that can last anywhere from 1,000 to 10,000 years, reaches a minimum threshold, fragments into multiple competing poles, and then reestablishes in the opposite orientation. What we are experiencing now is the rapid descent phase of that weakening, compressed into a timeline that the models did not predict. The South Atlantic anomaly, the region of already weakened field over the South Atlantic that has been monitored with concern for decades, expanded to encompass nearly 40% of Earth's surface in the past 2 weeks. The swarm satellites that were measuring this expansion are now gone. We are, in a very real sense, flying blind into the most consequential geophysical event in human history.
There is a family in Reykjavik, Iceland, that I keep thinking about. Iceland is one of the few places on Earth where people have a cultural memory of auroras. They are ordinary there, unremarkable. Children grow up knowing what they are. But the physicist at the University of Iceland who monitors space weather told a reporter before the communications went down that what she was seeing in the sky above Reykjavik was not the aurora she grew up with. She said the colors were wrong. She said the movement was wrong. She said it pulsed in patterns she had no reference for, and that the instruments she used to measure aurora activity had simply stopped producing meaningful readings because the values were beyond their designed range. She said she went home that night and sat at the kitchen table with her daughter, who was 7 years old, and her daughter looked at the sky through the window and said, "Mama, the sky is sick." That child said the thing the scientists were struggling to find language for. The sky is sick. The field that keeps us safe is failing, and we are all sitting at the kitchen table watching it happen.
The first infrastructure casualties were the satellites. This is where the cascade begins, and where the timeline accelerates into something that most people were not prepared for. The global satellite constellation consists of approximately 9,000 active operational satellites in various orbital bands. The primary vulnerability is not the magnetic field weakening itself, but the consequence of that weakening. The loss of the magnetosphere means that solar wind particles that would normally be deflected now impact satellite electronics directly. A single significant solar event under these conditions produces what engineers call a single event upset in semiconductor circuits. In practical terms, it means satellites fail, unpredictably and permanently. In the first 4 days after the swarm confirmation, 214 operational satellites failed. The GPS constellation, which requires a minimum of 24 healthy satellites to provide global coverage, is currently operating with 11. 11. Below 24, the positional accuracy degrades to a point where aviation navigation becomes unreliable, maritime navigation becomes dangerous, and the precision agriculture systems that help feed 3 billion people stop functioning. We crossed that threshold 3 days ago.
Every pilot in the world woke up to a world where their instruments were lying to them. I want to be specific about what that means in human terms, because I think we talk about aviation navigation failure as an abstract systems problem, and it is not. It is a pilot sitting in the cockpit of a commercial aircraft somewhere over the Pacific Ocean, looking at a GPS readout that says one thing and a compass that says another, and a horizon that, because of the extraordinary auroral activity distorting their visual field at high altitude, is not behaving in the way it should. Air traffic control in Auckland, New Zealand issued a complete ground stop for all international flights within 12 hours of the navigation degradation becoming critical. The Federal Aviation Administration in Washington did the same. 37 aircraft that were already in the air during the transition period had to navigate to landing, using dead reckoning and voice guidance from ground controllers. The methods used before electronic navigation existed, the methods that pilots now learn as emergency backup but almost never use. All 37 landed safely. I want to say that clearly. Every one of them landed safely. The pilots were extraordinary, but commercial aviation as we know it has stopped. The skies are empty.
The power grid failures began in the regions of highest geomagnetic activity and spread outward. When the magnetosphere weakens, geomagnetically induced currents, GICs, are generated in any long conductive infrastructure. Power transmission lines, gas pipelines, railway tracks, undersea cables. A GIC flows through a transformer in a way it was not designed for and burns it out. High voltage transformers are not off-the-shelf items. They are custom built. They weigh up to 900 tons. They take 12 to 18 months to manufacture under normal industrial conditions. And the global inventory of spares is essentially zero, because utilities have historically operated on the assumption that simultaneous transformer failures on this scale were not possible. The Quebec blackout of 1989, caused by a solar storm affecting a field that was still 92% intact, took out the entire Quebec provincial grid in 90 seconds and left 6 million people without power for 9 hours. That event is now used as the benchmark. What is happening now is to the 1989 Quebec event what a hurricane is to a stiff breeze. The Texas grid failed completely. The UK national grid began shedding load in automated protection mode. Germany's grid operator reported 47 simultaneous transformer failures in a single day.
When the lights went out in Berlin, they did not go out all at once. They went out the way a sentence trails off when the speaker loses confidence. The outer districts first, Spandau, Reinickendorf, Marzahn, flickering for a day before going dark. Then the inner ring, then the center. A journalist who was in Mitte when the last grid section failed described it as a city exhaling. She said the digital billboards went, then the traffic signals, then the street lights, and then after a moment's pause, as if the city was deciding, the windows of the apartment buildings went dark floor by floor, top to bottom, as backup power reserves were exhausted. She said Berlin at that moment was the darkest she had ever seen any major city. She said it was also unexpectedly not silent. She said people came to their windows. She said people came out into the streets. She said there was no screaming, no panic, not immediately. She said people just stood and looked at each other in the dark, and the sky above them was the most extraordinary thing she had ever seen, pulsing green and white and deep violet, the whole vault of it alive with magnetic fire. And she said that in that moment the city looked like it was standing at the edge of something, and no one knew which way it would fall.
The radiation exposure timeline is the most medically urgent dimension of this crisis, and it is the one receiving the least public attention. The magnetosphere's primary biological function is to prevent high-energy cosmic rays and solar energetic particles from reaching the surface at lethal concentrations. At 8% field strength, the radiation dose at the Earth's surface has increased by a factor of approximately 11 compared to baseline. This is not immediately lethal to healthy adults in short exposures. The danger is cumulative. People who work outdoors, people at high altitude, air crew, astronauts, patients undergoing radiation therapy, whose treatment protocols are now completely disrupted. All of them are accumulating dose at rates the models were not designed to predict. The International Space Station was evacuated 6 days ago. The 3 crew members aboard performed a rapid undocking in the Soyuz emergency vehicle and splashed down in the Kazakh steppe. They are alive, but they sustained radiation doses during the evacuation that will require years of medical monitoring. The polar regions, which were already the weakest points in the magnetospheric shield, are now receiving cosmic ray flux that is measurable at ground level with instruments normally used to detect nuclear contamination.
I have spent the last several days reading every message that comes into our signal. The letters, the radio call-ins, the satellite phone transmissions that still occasionally get through. And I want to share something I have noticed. People are not mostly writing about the darkness or the radiation or the navigation failure. They are writing about the sky. From every continent, from every kind of person, in every language, the messages describe the same thing. The sky has become something they cannot stop looking at. A farmer in Manitoba, Canada, who has been farming the same land for 40 years, wrote that the aurora over his fields is so bright that he harvested his crop at night this week because the light was sufficient and the sky was better company than he had words for. A fisherman in the Azores, who cannot use his GPS and cannot safely leave the harbor, wrote that he has spent 3 days sitting on the dock watching the magnetic storm above the Atlantic, and that it is the most violent and beautiful thing he has ever seen in a life spent at sea. A monk in a monastery in the mountains of Bhutan wrote that his entire community has stopped speaking. He said they are simply watching. He said the silence feels appropriate. He said some things should be received in silence.
The maritime situation represents a secondary catastrophe that is developing in parallel with the grid failures. The global shipping fleet of approximately 96,000 commercial vessels depends on GPS and magnetic compass navigation. With GPS degraded to 11 satellites and magnetic compasses now pointing to a pole that has moved unpredictably, safe open ocean navigation requires either celestial navigation by trained officers, a skill that has atrophied significantly in the satellite era, or position fixes from shore-based radio navigation systems like LORAN, most of which were decommissioned in the 2000s as GPS made them redundant. The International Maritime Organization issued a directive requiring all vessels to heave to or enter port within 72 hours of the GPS degradation announcement. Not all vessels complied or were able to comply in time. The container ship MV Stella Mer, carrying food and medical supplies from Rotterdam to Cape Town, ran aground on the Canary Island shelf after a navigation error. All 22 crew members survived, but the cargo, including insulin and chemotherapy drugs intended for hospitals in sub-Saharan Africa, is lost. The Stella Mare is one of 14 confirmed groundings in the first week. The number of vessels simply stopped and drifting in open ocean, waiting for guidance that may not come, is in the hundreds.
There is a dimension of this crisis that I find myself reluctant to talk about because it sounds too large, too cosmic, too far from the daily concerns of the people who are listening in the dark with a battery-powered radio. But I think it needs to be said. This is the first time in human history that this has happened to a civilized world. Every previous magnetic reversal, every previous weakening of this magnitude occurred before writing, before cities, before agriculture, before any of the systems we have built our lives on. When the field last reversed, the beings walking the earth were making tools from flint. They had fire. They had community. They had enough to survive the sky going strange. They did not have power grids or satellites or hospital ventilators or insulin supply chains or digital communication networks or a global food system dependent on precision navigation. We built all of that in the window of magnetic stability. We built it without asking what would happen if the window closed. Now we are finding out.
Let me talk about the specific countries where the crisis is compounding most severely. South Korea and Japan sit in the northern Pacific, which has been experiencing some of the most intense geomagnetically induced current activity on Earth. South Korea's nuclear power fleet, which generates approximately 30% of the country's electricity, has been taken offline as a precautionary measure. The electronic control systems in nuclear plants are extraordinarily sensitive to electromagnetic disruption, and the operators are not willing to run those risks. The shutdown of 9 reactors simultaneously, combined with the grid infrastructure damage from GIC events, has left Seoul without stable power for the 5th consecutive day. A city of 10 million people, one of the most technologically advanced urban environments on Earth, operating on emergency reserves and the rotating blackout schedule that the utility companies are struggling to maintain. The Han River, which supplies Seoul's drinking water, requires electric pumps to function. The water utility has switched to diesel backup, but diesel supplies are being rationed because the transport network that would normally resupply them has been disrupted. A city of 10 million people rationing water. That sentence would have been science fiction a month ago.
A woman in Seoul named Park Ji-young has been posting updates on a community radio frequency that a neighbor helped her broadcast on. She is a retired school teacher. She says that her apartment building, which has 42 floors and 217 units, has organized itself. She says that the younger residents who have physical strength are carrying water up the stairs from the ground floor storage tanks to the elderly residents on the upper floors who cannot manage the climb. She says that a doctor who lives on the 12th floor has opened his apartment as a medical station and is seeing everyone who comes. She says that 2 nights ago someone dragged a piano out of one of the ground floor apartments and into the courtyard of the building, and that a young man played for 3 hours while the sky above the city pulsed with light, and that people listened from their windows and their balconies in the dark, wrapped in whatever they had, in silence except for the music. She is not sending these updates for any particular purpose. She said she is sending them because she wants the record to exist, because she wants someone to know that in the middle of everything, people played the piano.
The communication infrastructure collapse is accelerating, and I want to be transparent about what that means for this broadcast. The Internet, as a global network, is now functioning at approximately 19% of normal capacity. The subsea cable network, which carries 95% of international Internet traffic, is vulnerable not to the magnetic field directly, but to the geomagnetically induced currents flowing through the cable's metallic components. Signal amplifiers called repeaters, placed at regular intervals along the cables to boost transmission, are failing. When a repeater fails in a subsea cable, the entire cable segment it serves goes dark. In the past week, 41 of the 63 major transoceanic cable systems have experienced repeater failures. The internet is not going out like a light. It is going out like a net, with the threads being cut one by one. Voice calls, traditional telephony, are in better shape because much of the fixed-line telephone infrastructure uses different technology. Shortwave radio, which we are broadcasting on right now, is both resilient and degraded in unusual ways by the ionospheric disruption. Some frequencies are carrying further than normal. Others have gone completely silent. We are testing frequencies continuously. If this signal fades, we will find another.
In Nairobi, Kenya, the Kibera settlement, which is home to somewhere between 250,000 and 1 million people depending on which census you believe, has been in darkness for 9 days. But here's what I want to tell you about Kibera. It was in darkness before this happened. The electrification rate in informal settlements across the global south was already catastrophically low before the magnetic field began to fail. What has changed for the residents of Kibera is not the darkness. The darkness is not new. What has changed is that the phone network towers, which were the one technological lifeline many of them had, are now mostly down. The phones still work as devices. There's just nothing for them to connect to. A community organizer there, who has been in contact with our team via a still-functioning satellite uplink, said something that I think is important. She said the rest of the world is now learning what it is like to lose the infrastructure you took for granted. She said her community has survival knowledge that the rest of the world is going to need. She said she is not bitter about that. She said she is ready to teach.
The aviation ground stop has produced a secondary crisis in global medical supply chains that is already manifesting in mortality statistics. The most time-sensitive medical supplies in the world move by air. Blood products, organs for transplant, certain vaccines, insulin in quantities that exceed cold chain truck capacity, chemotherapy agents with short stability windows. With the ground stops in effect across North America, Europe, East Asia, and Australia, these supply chains have been severed. The United Kingdom's National Health Service reported that 3 patients awaiting emergency organ transplants died after organs that were en route by air were unable to be delivered. In Brazil, the Public Health Authority confirmed that insulin stocks in 11 northeastern states will be exhausted within 14 days at current consumption rates. In the Philippines, which relies heavily on imported pharmaceutical ingredients to manufacture generic drugs domestically, the health ministry has declared a pharmaceutical emergency. The people dying of insulin shock and transplant failure and treatable infections in this first week are the leading edge of a mortality wave that will build over months if the aviation network does not reestablish. They are dying of the consequences of a sky that cannot be flown through safely anymore.
I want to talk about children, because children are in this crisis in a particular way that the coverage does not fully capture. Children do not have the cognitive framework to understand what a magnetic pole reversal is. They cannot contextualize it. They know the lights are off. They know the sky is doing something it has never done before. They know that the adults around them are frightened even when those adults are trying not to show it. And they are constructing their own explanations, which are sometimes more honest than ours. A psychologist in Sydney, Australia, who has been documenting children's responses to the crisis, shared some of what she is hearing. A 6-year-old told her that the Earth is turning its face away from the sun, like how he turns away when he is embarrassed. A 9-year-old said the world is changing its mind. A 12-year-old, who had clearly been listening to more information than her parents realized, said, "The Earth is not dying, it is becoming something different. And we have to become something different, too." That 12-year-old, I keep thinking about her. I keep thinking she has more clarity than most of the emergency management briefings I have read this week.
The military and governmental response has been fragmented in ways that reflect both the scale of the crisis and the limits of institutional preparation. NATO's integrated air defense network, which depends on satellite communication and GPS-guided targeting, is operating at substantially reduced capacity. The United States military has transitioned to what it calls degraded operations mode, which essentially means falling back on pre-satellite era protocols, encrypted shortwave communication, dead reckoning navigation for aircraft and ships, and the use of land-based radio beacons that were kept operational as legacy infrastructure. Russia's military has shown remarkable resilience because Russian doctrine has historically maintained greater investment in non-satellite communication and navigation as a deliberate strategic hedge. China's People's Liberation Army has declared a national scientific and military emergency and deployed engineering brigades to protect critical transformer infrastructure, which is the correct priority and which other nations are only now beginning to replicate. India has ordered all nuclear power plants to immediate cold shutdown as a precautionary measure. The global nuclear arsenal remains secure, so far as anyone can verify, because the launch authorization systems were specifically hardened after the 1989 Quebec event. That is one piece of genuinely good news in a landscape that is short of it.
There's a couple in Tromsø, Norway, where the magnetic disruption is most extreme, who have been married for 53 years. Tromsø is above the Arctic Circle. It is the city most familiar with the aurora on Earth. And the man, a retired meteorologist named Lars, told a Norwegian radio correspondent something that I have not been able to stop thinking about. He said that in 53 years of watching the sky from Tromsø, he had cataloged more aurora observations than he could count. He had a notebook. He had been keeping the notebook since 1974. He said the sky he has been watching for the past 10 days is not in the notebook. He said there is no page for it. He said it is not that the aurora is bigger or brighter, although it is both of those things. He said it is that it moves with intention. He said he knows that sounds unscientific. He said he is a scientist and he is telling you it moves with intention. He said he and his wife sit outside every night in the cold. It is very cold in Tromsø, and they watch. He said they have not been inside together this much in the evening since their children were small. He said he finds himself grateful for that, at the end of the world or not.
By the second week, the logistics of emergency resource distribution are collapsing in regions that were already operating at the margins. The World Food Programme's logistics network depends on fuel, on communication, on navigation, and on the functioning of the ports and airports through which aid moves. All four of those dependencies are now compromised simultaneously. The WFP's executive director issued an emergency statement saying that their capacity to distribute food aid in the Horn of Africa, in Yemen, in the Sahel, in parts of South and Southeast Asia, has been reduced by approximately 60% due to transport and communication failures. For the populations those programs serve, which include 120 million people in acute food insecurity, a 60% reduction in WFP capacity is not a logistical problem. It is a death sentence at scale. Somalia, which has been entirely dependent on international food aid for prolonged periods, is in a situation that WFP field staff are privately describing as unsurvivable without immediate resupply. The word unsurvivable is in a field report. I am reading it to you directly. It is in a field report, and the world cannot currently get aid to the people it describes.
I received a transmission yesterday from a woman in Mogadishu. I am not going to share her name because she asked me not to. She is a nurse. She works in a clinic that has been operating without reliable power or supply for longer than this crisis has existed. Because for Mogadishu, this is not a new condition. It is the existing condition made worse. She said, I want you to know that we are still here. She said, I want you to know that we opened the clinic this morning the same as every morning. She said, I want you to know that there were people waiting. She said, I want you to know that when the lights are gone and the equipment fails and the supply trucks do not come, there is still something to do. You can sit with someone who is afraid. You can hold a hand. You can tell the truth about what you know and be honest about what you do not know. She said, that is medicine too. She said, that has always been medicine. I did not have an answer for her. I'm not sure there is one. But I am holding what she said, and I'm asking you to hold it too, because she deserves to be held.
The ozone layer interaction is a dimension of this crisis that needs more airtime than it is getting. The magnetosphere and the ozone layer work in concert to protect the surface from ultraviolet radiation. As the magnetosphere fails, the flux of charged particles from the solar wind increases dramatically in the upper atmosphere. High-energy proton events, solar proton events, or SPEs, destroy ozone molecules through a catalytic chemical reaction involving nitrogen oxides. The World Meteorological Organization confirmed that stratospheric ozone concentrations over the polar regions have declined by 38% in 14 days. This is not a localized ozone hole of the kind caused by chlorofluorocarbons. This is a global reduction driven by a physical process that no regulation or emission reduction can address. The practical implication is that the ultraviolet radiation reaching the surface, especially at high latitudes, is rising. Crops are susceptible to UV damage. Phytoplankton, which produces approximately 50% of Earth's oxygen and forms the base of the ocean food chain, is exquisitely sensitive to UV exposure. The marine biology community is alarmed at a level that is difficult to communicate without sounding like a science fiction plot. The ocean's ability to feed us and to breathe for us is under direct attack.
The farmers are not waiting for government guidance. I want to say that clearly because I think it matters. In Saskatchewan, Canada, where the growing season is short and the land is vast and the farming families have been reading the land for generations, the agricultural community has organized its own response. They are covering vulnerable crops with shade cloth. They are moving livestock indoors earlier than any season has ever required. They are sharing diesel and parts and expertise through the rural cooperative networks that have existed in that landscape since the early 20th century. A farmer outside Saskatoon told a community broadcaster that his grandfather survived the Dust Bowl and his father survived drought and debt, and that surviving hard things is what that land teaches you. He said the sky had never tried to kill him before, but the land had, and he knew what to do with that. He said he was going to plant next year, whether or not the situation improved. He said that is what farmers do. We plant. I find something irreducible about that. The sky is falling, and the farmers are planting next season. I find it one of the most human things I have ever heard.
The technical dimension of the road back from this crisis requires understanding what restoration actually means in this context. A magnetic pole reversal does not have an off switch. It is not an event that ends on a particular day. The reversal process, now that it has begun its rapid descent phase, is projected by the geophysical community to reach its minimum field strength sometime in the next several months to 2 years. At minimum, the field fragments into multiple competing poles. Scientists call this a polarity transition. And during this phase, which could last anywhere from a decade to several centuries based on paleomagnetic records, the field will be weaker and more chaotic than it is right now. After the transition, the field reestablishes in the reversed orientation and gradually strengthens back to something approaching its original intensity over thousands of years. The civilization that survives this transition will live in a world where magnetic compasses point south, where the auroras are permanent features of mid-latitude skies, and where the satellite and grid infrastructure must be completely redesigned around electromagnetic hardening standards that do not currently exist. We are not recovering to a previous normal. We are building toward a new one.
Stockholm, Sweden is a city I know well, a city of extraordinary civic organization and institutional trust. I want to tell you what is happening there because I think it illustrates something important about what human beings are capable of when the institutions that normally structure their lives ask them to step up. The Swedish government issued a national emergency communication 6 days ago. It was calm, detailed, and honest. It told people exactly what was happening. It told them what services would fail and in what order. It told them what the government could provide and what it could not. It told them what it needed from citizens and why. And the Swedish people responded in a way that I think will be studied for a long time. Volunteerism registrations overloaded the government platform within a day. Neighborhood mutual aid networks that had been dormant since the pandemic reactivated within hours. 12,000 people enrolled in an emergency amateur radio operator certification course that the government broadcast on national television because shortwave communication operators were needed urgently. 12,000 people in a city of 1 million decided within days that learning to operate a radio transmitter was the most useful thing they could do. That is not a statistic. That is a civilization deciding to survive.
I need to address the nuclear power situation in detail because it is the most significant ongoing infrastructure risk that is not being discussed with sufficient clarity in official communications. There are 442 operational nuclear reactors globally. They are distributed across 32 countries. Their electronic control systems, particularly the older Generation 2 reactors that make up the majority of the global fleet, were not designed to withstand the magnitude of electromagnetic disruption that geomagnetically induced currents at current levels can produce. The nuclear industry's hardening standards for electromagnetic pulse events were calibrated against weapons-derived EMP models, not against geomagnetic storms of this intensity. 17 reactors globally have already experienced control system anomalies requiring emergency shutdown. All 17 achieved safe cold shutdown. The International Atomic Energy Agency has deployed every available technical expert to the highest risk facilities. The facilities of greatest concern are the older Soviet-era reactors in Ukraine, Armenia, and Bulgaria, where the original construction specifications and the subsequent maintenance history create uncertainty about the actual electromagnetic hardening state of the control systems. The IAEA experts are on the ground. The situation is being managed, but managed is not the same as resolved.
I want to spend a moment on the people who are holding the technical infrastructure together right now, because they are not getting nearly enough recognition. The electrical grid engineers who have been awake for 6, 7, 8 days running, manually managing load-shedding decisions that are usually automated, trying to protect the surviving transformer infrastructure by routing power around the most vulnerable points. The amateur radio operators, the ham radio community, which has been treated as a hobby, as a remnant of an older era, who are now the primary communication backbone for emergency management in dozens of countries because their equipment was already hardened and their skills were already developed. The maritime pilots who are guiding vessels into harbor using nothing but their own knowledge of local waters and the stars. The astronomers at observatories around the world who have retrained themselves as navigation consultants overnight, teaching ship officers and pilots to use celestial bodies for positioning in a world where GPS cannot be trusted. These people did not sign up to be the last line of anything. They signed up to know their field deeply, and the depth they carry turns out to be exactly what is needed right now.
The economic devastation is entering a phase that goes beyond the capacity of conventional financial instruments to address. The global insurance industry faces claims exposure from satellite failures, grid transformer damage, aviation groundings, and maritime incidents that preliminary actuarial models suggest could exceed $4 trillion. The reinsurance industry, which backstops primary insurers, does not have the reserves to cover losses of this magnitude. This is not speculation. The heads of 3 major reinsurance firms issued a joint statement acknowledging that standard policy exclusions for acts of God and force majeure events were written with different scenarios in mind, and that the legal landscape around magnetic reversal-related claims is entirely uncharted. In practical terms, this means that utilities whose transformers were destroyed may not receive insurance payouts and may lack the capital to replace them. It means that airlines whose fleets are grounded may be uninsured for the duration of the grounding. It means that the financial mechanism through which damaged infrastructure is normally replaced has ceased. Governments are the insurer of last resort, and governments are operating in fiscal environments that were already stressed. The fiscal math of the recovery, when it comes, will be brutal.
A hospital in Karachi, Pakistan, the Aga Khan University Hospital, which is one of the finest medical institutions in South Asia, has been running on a single backup generator for 4 days. The hospital's chief of medicine recorded a message that was transmitted to us via satellite phone. He said, "We have made a decision. We are going to keep the intensive care unit and the neonatal ward running at full capacity for as long as the fuel lasts. Everything else, the elective surgeries, the outpatient clinics, the administrative systems, everything else stops." He said, "We have enough fuel for the ICU and neonatal ward for 11 more days." He said, "We are sending people out into the city to find more." He said, "I have 53 patients in the ICU who will die if the power stops and 14 infants in the neonatal ward who were born too early to survive without the incubators." He said, "I am not losing any of them." He said it the way you say something that is not a wish, but a decision. A decision made at the edge of everything with complete clarity and complete commitment. I want that man to know that someone heard him. I want those patients to know someone is holding their names.
The geophysical data we are receiving from the remaining ground stations paints a picture of what the next phase looks like. And I want to be direct about it, because clarity is more useful than comfort. The field is expected to fragment over the next several months into what paleomagnetic records call a multipolar state. A configuration where instead of 2 magnetic poles, the field develops 4 to 8 competing poles of varying strength at unpredictable locations. During this phase, the field provides no consistent global navigation reference. Compasses become useless or actively misleading depending on location. The radiation environment becomes spatially complex, some regions experiencing near normal protection because they sit over a local field concentration, others experiencing near zero protection because they sit between poles. The aurora will be visible permanently from equatorial regions. High-altitude crops, anything grown above 3,000 meters, which includes a significant proportion of the world's Andean grain, Ethiopian highland agriculture, and Himalayan farming, will face chronic UV radiation at levels that suppress photosynthesis. The world is going to need to redesign where it grows food, where it builds its infrastructure, and how it navigates. This is the work of a generation. It begins now.
I have been doing this broadcast for a long time now without sleep, and I want to tell you something honest. There are moments in a story like this where the accumulation of loss becomes very heavy. The nurse in Mogadishu, and the babies in Karachi, and the ships drifting without navigation, and the crops that are being damaged right now in fields that someone planted with hope. All of that weight is real, and it sits on me, and I suspect it sits on you. And I also want to tell you the other thing I have been carrying, the piano in the courtyard in Seoul, the farmer in Saskatchewan who is already planning next season, the 12,000 Swedes who learned to operate shortwave radios in a week, the meteorologist in Tromsø filling a new notebook, the children who look at the sky and say things the scientists cannot. There is something irreducible in human beings, something that does not switch off when the lights do. I have been a journalist for 23 years, and I have seen it in every catastrophe I have covered. It does not make the catastrophe smaller, it makes the human being larger. And I keep coming back to that. I keep coming back to the human being who is larger than what is happening to them.
The question I am asked most often in the transmissions that reach us is, when does this end? And I want to answer it as precisely as I can. The electromagnetic disruption of the transition period, the worst of the satellite failures, the grid damage, the navigation degradation, is expected to stabilize, not recover, but stabilize, once the field reaches its minimum and begins its multipolar phase. The models suggest this stabilization occurs within 6 to 18 months. That is a stabilization, not a restoration. A stabilization means the situation stops getting worse at the current rate. Recovery of the satellite constellation, assuming aggressive manufacturing and launch programs, requires a minimum of 3 to 5 years. Recovery of the power grid to pre-crisis functionality, given the transformer replacement challenge, requires 5 to 10 years in optimistic scenarios. Full restoration of the magnetic field to pre-reversal strength requires thousands of years. The civilization on the other side of this transition will be built on different foundations. It will not have the luxury of the magnetic stability we took for granted. It will have hardened its infrastructure. It will have diversified its navigation. It will have learned to read the sky in ways we forgot. It will be different. It will also, I believe, be resilient in ways we are not, because it will have been tested.
There is an elderly woman in a village outside Cusco, Peru, in the Andes, at an altitude of 3,500 meters. Her name is Alejandra. She is 78 years old. She is a weaver. Her family has lived in that village for as long as the family's memory goes. She sent a message through a local amateur radio operator who relayed it through a chain of operators across South America until it reached us. The message was short. She said, "We can see the lights in the sky. We have always seen the lights in the sky." She said, "Our grandmothers taught us that when the sky moves like this, the earth is remembering something it forgot." She said, "We are not afraid." She said, "We are watching. I do not know what the earth is remembering. I am a journalist and not a mystic. But I find myself unable to dismiss what she said. There is knowledge in that high village that is older than our satellite networks, and older than our power grids, and older than every institution whose failure we have been documenting. It did not come from nowhere. It came from people who have been paying attention to this planet for a very long time. And right now they are watching the sky, and they are not afraid."
The reconstruction challenge is unlike anything human civilization has attempted before, because it requires not merely rebuilding what existed, but rethinking the foundational assumptions on which what existed was built. Every satellite in the new constellation will need to be hardened to electromagnetic radiation standards 10 times more stringent than current requirements. Every major transformer in the global grid will need to be replaced with geomagnetically resilient designs and protected by rapid response GIC mitigation systems. Every commercial aircraft will need to be equipped with celestial navigation backup systems. Every deep-sea cable will need GIC isolation hardware at every repeater. The entire global navigation system will need to be redesigned around systems that function without a stable magnetic reference, inertial navigation, celestial navigation, and a rebuilt ground-based radio navigation network. This is not a 10-year project or a 20-year project. This is the defining infrastructure project of the next century. And it requires an international cooperation framework that makes the Marshall Plan look modest. The nations of the world will have to decide whether the shared existential threat posed by a weakened magnetosphere is sufficient to override the competitive and ideological divisions that normally prevent that scale of cooperation. I believe it is sufficient. I also know that history does not always go where the logic points.
Before we close this segment, I want to read one more message. It came in on a frequency I won't specify because the operator asked us not to. It is from a 16-year-old girl in a city I will also not name, in a country whose government has restricted unofficial broadcasting. She says, "I have been listening to you for 3 days." She says, "I am not scared of the sky." She says, "I know that sounds strange, but I am not." She says, "I think something is being asked of us, and I think we are going to answer it." She says, "I don't know what we will build on the other side of this." She says, "But I want to help build it." She says, "I am going to be a scientist." She says, "I'm going to spend my whole life understanding what is happening right now and making sure we are never this unprepared again." She says, "Please keep broadcasting." She says, "People are listening. They are. You are." A 16-year-old girl in the dark has decided she is going to be a scientist. The sky is falling, and she is deciding her vocation. The Earth's shield is failing, and somewhere in the dark, a future scientist is taking notes. This is Last Signal Radio. We are not signing off. We are staying on. For her. For all of you. For the record. For the next morning, whenever it comes.
I want to address directly the governments that are listening to this broadcast, because I know some of them are, and I want to say something that may not align with every official communication they are issuing. Transparency is not a threat to stability. In this crisis, in every crisis I have covered, the institutions that maintained public trust were the ones that told the truth about what they knew and what they did not know, what they could do and what they could not, what was coming and what could be prevented. The institutions that lost trust were the ones that issued reassurances that the scale of the situation made impossible to believe. Your citizens are not children. They are people who are already living with the reality of this crisis in their bodies, in their blackouts, in their empty skies and strange lights and missing medicine. They know. They are already knowing. The question is whether you trust them with the full picture. I am asking you to trust them, because what comes next requires every person on this planet to understand what they are part of, and to make informed decisions about how they participate in the reconstruction. You cannot build the next civilization on a foundation of managed information. You have to build it on the truth.
I want to end this broadcast. Not end, we are not ending, but I want to mark this moment with something that happened in my own building last night. I live in a neighborhood that has been without reliable grid power for 5 days. Last night, the building's residents gathered in the lobby. It was lit by candles and by the aurora through the glass doors, which was extraordinary. Violet and silver and moving in ways that made the building feel like it was inside a living thing. Someone brought food. Someone else brought instruments. An older man who lives on the 3rd floor, who I have seen in the elevator for 3 years and never spoken to beyond hello, sat down and played guitar for 2 hours. We did not talk about the crisis. We talked about ourselves. Our lives, our families, what we missed, what we were grateful for. The woman on the 4th floor told me she had been a botanist before she retired, and that she had been using the extra ultraviolet light to study the changes in her window plants, and that she had found something she had never seen before, and that she thought it was important. A retired botanist studying adaptation in her window by the light of a magnetic storm. This is what I mean when I say the human being is larger than what is happening to them. We are always, always larger. This is Last Signal Radio, James Carter and Kate Vincent. We are here. We are with you. We are not going anywhere.